We're back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. We had Thomas Frank on last week. What's the matter with Kansas? The topic of this segment will be what's the matter with France. My guest, returning once again, I always look forward to speaking with him, is Cole Stangler. Cole is a freelance journalist based in Paris, and he's written a number of pieces on the last several months about not only French politics, but about UN sanctions. And he had a piece in the New York Times a couple weeks ago. First of all, I should preface it by saying if my French grandmother were still alive, she would have been so horrified by the headline, she never would have gotten any further because she hated this country from the moment she got here till the day she died. And the headline the Times gave to Cole's piece is, France is becoming more like America. It's terrible. So we'll start off talking about that and see where we go. So first of all, Cole Stangler, welcome back to the program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
It's always great talking with you. And I really enjoyed the piece, while I also found it depressing, in the Times about France. And I like the way you start out by saying, the common refrain among, the Macronistas and so on, President Macron and others is, well, France is becoming Americanized because there's too much cancel culture or what have you, but that's not really the way that France is becoming Americanized to its own detriment. Have I summarized that accurately?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, it's something that people kind of throw this word around a lot, and people have done this for decades.
Of course.
To some degree, in France, they're obsessed with Americanization, but it's sort of like ebbs and flows. How often we're going to be, using this charge to describe whatever we're upset about in French society. So I do want to say, it's not like this has just immediately come out of nowhere, because some people, after reading the piece, sort of highlighted that criticism. But it is being used more and more today, this term, to Americanization, to refer to a whole set of different unconnected sort of cultural, political developments that certain people in France do not like. And so, this is like multiculturalism, people obsessed with, highlighting people's ethnic differences or religious differences or sexual differences. This is like super American, and this is undermining, the universal promise of the French nation and the way that French identity is conceived, which is that we don't recognize race or religion in theory.
As long as everybody behaves like they're ethnically French. That was always my take on that. Maybe I'm being unfair. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there've always been holes in the model. I don't know, the whole colonial experience. For one, the intense racism that people of North African descent face today in France when it comes to the police. So France is not a colorblind society, but the way that it's conceptually on paper, it is. And so we've heard this term been thrown around a lot, Americanization. You had the education ministers talking about the pernicious influence of American theories that are making people obsessed with these racial differences, wokeness, cancel culture. All of this is infecting France, according to these people. And even Macron was talking about, the president of France was talking about the influence of the pernicious American influence. One time, I think he gave a speech talking about where he mentioned American theories hurting, France's ability to debate and important political issues.
I mean, to a certain extent, this has always been, at least as long as I can recall, a French pastime, right? I mean, there was this image of France going back to the 60s and 70s of, on the one hand, they're constantly bemoaning the infiltration of American culture into French life, and then they're giving a prize to Jerry Lewis for his slapstick comedy. You know, there was always this sort of sense of this weird love-hate relationship the French had with us. Is that was what this is about, or is this something? And I'm specifically talking before we get to your thesis. Is this what the Macron and further right people are talking about? This kind, or demonstrating this kind of we like them, but we're better than them, and their wokeness is bringing us down. I mean, what exactly is that phenomenon?
Well, I think Emmanuel Macron certainly likes American business culture a lot. He certainly likes American startup culture and American business and American innovation. And from his point of view, and he wants to bring that into France. So I think there's certainly a contradiction there. But I think this is really used as sort of a kind of way of scoring political points. It's kind of a charge you throw around, and I almost don't want to give too much credit to it because it's sort of used as a weapon. It's a rhetorical weapon you can use to sort of criticize your opponent, and that's the way that it's used mostly today in France. I think obviously we're way past the American culture is everywhere in France. I mean, people are watching Netflix. People are wearing like American clothes, like anywhere in the world. So I think we're well past that point now. It's just the fact of life. We live in a globalized society, but I think the thesis, this is all sort of the wind up to the argument that I made in the piece, is that there is all this obsession on how basically, to cut to the chase, Americanization is a problem, from the left, college students that are obsessed with being woke, cancel culture, multiculturalism, blah, 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 blah. That's what it's talking about. But the real Americanization today in France that I think is seriously problematic is what we're seeing happen to the French right today. The French right has adopted the sort of culture war mentality that is so prevalent in the United States. The French right has decided to hone in on a handful of sort of controversial social issues because it sees that as a way to rally its base and to define a common enemy. And the French right has also now has its very own TV channel that it can call its own, similar to Fox News in the United States. And this channel is C News. And C News is helping to sort of fuel this obsession with these, in my estimation, ultimately secondary debates of little importance to people's actual material conditions, to their material conditions in their actual lives, but make for good television and make for good debate. And I think that is what we're seeing today in France. And it's sort of hard to describe because I was kind of struggling with this as I was writing the piece. Even it's sort of like these sort of dumbing down of political debate and the sort of incessant focus on culture wars. It's sort of hard to capture. You sort of just feel it. You feel it being in the United States under Trump. The media's focus on these sort of just dumb issues, and you feel it today in France when you look at the newspapers, you look at the TV. The news cycle is dominated by these incredibly insignificant stories that consume a lot of attention because it serves the right's political interests. And that's the sort of argument that I'm making in the piece. It's not just the far right, but it's actually the government itself is playing along because they've decided it's in their interest to engage as well.
And and again, the piece by my guest Cole Stangler in the New York Times, France is becoming more like America. It's terrible. The piece is really well written, Cole, so I congratulate you for that. But you say you describe it as the rise of an insular, nationalistic right-wing discourse driven by a belligerent style of press coverage, distinctly French in content, grievance wallowing hosts conjuring embittered conversations about national decline, immigration, and religion. We know that songbook very well in this country. And, I found it not just, the headline positioned it as kind of, isn't it too bad they're becoming morons like us? But I found it a little scarier than that because the implication is that, you talk about C News, which you've already mentioned, launched by a conservative billionaire. The implication is that they could go down the same kind of rabbit hole, or worse kind of hole, I can't say on the air, that we've gone down in our politics. And, there have been problems with French politics all along, but the implications of any country's shift towards American style, right wing, media driven, lizard brain triggering, political discourse are in fact quite frightening, right? Don't you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also had some of the criticism of the piece. A few people. I was surprised it didn't generate as much negative pushback as I thought it might in France. But a few people saying, mostly, I think actually all Anglo-Americans saying, well, the French right has always had this really, influential reactionary current. The Dreyfus affair, that was a pretty important culture war, right? Okay, that's true. France does have its own sort of national pathologies, I think, like frankly any other country does.
Sure.
France has its horrible colonial history. The racism that exists today. It has anti-Semitism, the experience of collaboration under the Nazi occupation. France does have these, homegrown, for lack of a better word, problems. And that's not, I don't want to say that all this is just imported from the United States, but what I do think it is true is that you have this TV-driven focus on these sort of minute little affairs that don't really have any importance overall, but get blown up into these sort of national stories, and they're really driven forward by television. I don't know how to say it otherwise. It's the importance that TV and these sort of TV debates, these like fake TV debates, have in shifting the discourse. So to give you an example of one of these things, because I think it's so closely parallels the U.S. The newly elected, well, it was last year, but the newly elected Green Party mayor of the city of Lyon, the third biggest city in France, started rolling out vegetarian food in the cafeterias. Support local farmers, make everyone, make people healthier. All right, and this became this sort of national political issue because the mayor wanted to have vegetarian food in the canteen, in the cafeterias, the cantines in French, cafeterias, and this blew up into this important national political debate. And you have sort of like right wing figures posting pictures on Twitter of like meat. It's like, I'm not take the like meat out of my hands or whatever. Like hands, yeah. I've seen those same meat like memes in the U.S. where it's like you're not going to turn us all into sort of like feminized vegans. We saw it under the opposition of the Green New Deal, where it's going to take away your ability to eat hamburgers. And you had the same sort of like TV-driven, complementary social media outrage that's sort of dominating the news cycle. And the government is playing along in this as well. And I think all of this is really contributing to this right-wing shift that we're having. And obviously, there's support for this on the ground. I don't want to say this is just. It's just media that's totally responsible, but media has a pretty important role to play when it comes to influencing people's ideas. And just anecdotally, so always be careful to say just anecdotally, but talking to friends of mine, who've talked about how their parents have started watching C News, and they'll talk to them about like this, so and so affair, and my friends and acquaintances will be like, well, I don't know what you're talking about. But if you sit at home, and watch television, if you're retired, you're going to have a certain view of society. And I think that, is really what I say is is Americanization. I don't mean to say that France doesn't have its own pathologies and controversies, but this sort of TV-driven move to the right is extremely American, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I called Stangler when I was reading your piece, and critically as well as appreciatively. At one point, I thought, well, the British press is grotesquely right wing and hate mongering and all that. But so for a moment I thought, well, maybe you could call it the Britishization of France, but you're specifically talking about TV, and I think the TV angle is what distinguishes the American debasement of politics from the British debasement of politics. I'm not saying they don't have, loathsome broadcasters or whatever, but really, and I haven't spent a lot of time in Britain for a long time, but it's these god awful papers every morning. But
Yeah.
with this TV kind of constant neurological input through the eyes and ears, I did definitely see that as an American horrific innovation. So it must be, poor you. You've moved from the land of inane memes to a place that is turning into an echo of inane memeness. And I guess, so sorry about that, but I guess I would say maybe pivoting now
Yeah.
to the effect on politics. It's hard to infer big things from regional elections or what have you, but it's not impossible. There are clues there, I think. And France is going through just had some regional elections now. And I was curious to know if if you thought, first of all, before we talk about the results in general, basically Macron definitely disappointed, his party disappointed in this. Marine Le Pen, the far right, she disappointed. Just talking about Macron's, and it's a new party and so on, so they don't have an infrastructure some other parties might have, but I wondered, like tying it into your Times piece, whether perhaps Macron's embrace of this mindset maybe didn't help him or even hurt him or maybe didn't have any effect at all. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the big takeaway from the regional elections, what everyone's talking about here, really across the political spectrum, is what in France they call the abstention rate,
Mm-hmm.
meaning the people that did not vote. I think it's interesting also, this is an aside. In the U.S., we talk about turnout. In France, they measure the opposite, which is when people don't show up and vote.
Uh-huh.
So this election, you had the highest abstention rate. I think the second highest, if I'm not mistaken, abstention rate in the history of the Fifth Republic. So going back to the 50s, for an election, a national level election in France, I think there was a constitutional referendum over shortening the presidential terms from 7 to 5 years, where you had a higher abstention rate. But basically, this was the all-time record for electing officials. And I think right now, I'm not sure if they have the final figures yet, but basically 2/3 of French voters did not show up to this election. And the thing about this is that, when people don't vote, you can sort of project you can project a lot of things onto that. And, frankly, I see that, happening to some extent on the left already, where you can sort of take whatever conclusion you want because these people didn't vote and you can fit it into your political narrative. It's really hard to sort of pinpoint why people didn't vote. But I think what is fair to say is that there is a sort of disengagement from politics, a sense of disillusionment from politics, maybe a sense the regional elections didn't really matter that much. But at the end of the day, I think it's fair to say, I don't think I'm going too far here by saying there's a sort of disinterest or disillusionment from politics. And I think that is fair to say that's one of the factors here why people are not going to go and vote in an election. So, I think there's a case to be made. And again, I want to be careful about not speculating too much, but I think there's a case to be made that when you're following political life and the main debate is, about vegetarian food in a cafeteria or about, this other scandal in which a teenager was getting hate on Instagram because she called Islam a religion of hate. Now it's blown up to this whole national scandal. When that's what political debate is, and when it's about security all the time, when it's about immigration all the time on these, TV networks like C News notably, I think, that might make people not as interested in voting. And, more directly, when the two main political parties on offer right now that have been hammered into our heads are the two main parties are Macron's En Marche party and then Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party. When those are the two options that we've been told over and over again, these are what you have. People maybe aren't all that interested in that, and the disengagement doesn't only affect those two parties, but I think clearly it affects the other parties as well. You essentially had older, wealthier people voting, and that ultimately didn't favor the National Rally that much, and clearly didn't favor Macron's party that much either. Both parties did not do very well, and at the end of the day, the big winners, as we're approaching the second round coming up on Sunday, were basically the people that were already in place. So that's the quote unquote mainstream right, the Les Républicains party that is holding on. It appears likely it's going to hold on with majorities in place in these 18 different regions, 13 of them in metropolitan France. And then the Socialist Party, which was long ago, left for dead, that is sort of still hanging on to its regions after doing well in the municipal election. So you could also, not to blabber on too much, but you could also maybe talk about this sort of distinction between the national political debate and then what's happening on the regional and local level, where basically the same old people are more or less in place, with the exception of the Greens in the mayoral elections last year. But the big story is the low turnout.
Yeah, and again, I'm projecting Cole Stangler, I'm sure, my American electoral experience onto France a bit here, but when you have turnout that low, I mean, I think, 2/3 of people stayed home or something, roughly, you're in American low turnout territory now, off year election low turnout. And when that happens, although there's a tremendous temptation on my part, and I think a lot of people's parts, to say, well, this movement is up, this spectrum of the electorate is down, to project that to national trends, really, since you're only talking about roughly 1/3 of eligible voters, I think turnout becomes a huge factor, doesn't it? And, just who came when, and I don't know if ground, what we would call, ground game in the U.S. I don't know if that's a factor. And you raise another question for me. If in fact mostly older and more prosperous people voted, I would not have thought Macron's party would do so poorly. So I'm struggling to see what do you think? Is there any broader conclusion at all that can be drawn from this first round of regional elections?
I think what's interesting, if you look at the National Rally, is that, I did a piece for them looking at the one region that they arguably had the best chance of winning, and they still maybe have a chance of winning this region on Sunday in the south of France, in the region known as PACA, which is Provence. Why am I blanking right now as I'm speaking to you? Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur, sorry. So the basically southern region in France, so like Mediterranean coast, all the way up to, sort of the foothills of the Alps. This is a region that, they really anticipated to have, being able to win, in other regions as well. In the north, they thought they had a good chance. Burgundy as well, potentially. It's not over yet, but they didn't do that well. And I think, interestingly, one of the reasons I think is that, the National Rally has benefited in the past from this image of being this sort of like anti-establishment outsider party. And you obviously have, some clearly, people that are voting for the National Rally to some extent share their ideas about immigration and share their broader right-wing social agenda. That exists. I don't want to downplay that. That exists. But the RN has also benefited from this sort of outsider image. It's sort of an FU to the political system when you vote for the RN. And what's, I think, in some ways, ironic is that as the party is constantly trying to paint itself as being a party like the other parties, that it's normal, it's mainstream. It's recruited all these people from different parties. The candidate in the South is a former government minister under Sarkozy, who I interviewed for that piece. As they become more and more of a mainstream party, well, then, voters are sort of looking at them as like another mainstream party that's part of the same political establishment. And I think maybe they've sort of lost, that sort of extra I don't know,
That outsider edge or
yeah,
whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And again, I'll be careful because it's just regional elections, but
Right.
um, they did better in 2015 in the last one.
And I can't help it, Cole Stangler. I always want to see if this tells us anything about the mood of the electorate. And I'm not sure it does, to be honest, but exit polling from Ipsos showed Les Républicains, the conservatives, winning 20%, 27% of the vote, a little more than 1 in 4. National Rally with 19%, so that's close to half of the voters being, pretty hard right. The Greens, the Socialists, all, according to this, got about 11%. So if you basically lump the Greens and the Socialists together as the left, that's 22%. But then I've seen other results that say, in other parts of the country, the left aggregated did about 38%. What's interesting is that En Marche, the Macrons, didn't do any better than either the Greens or the Socialists individually. So I don't. Does that mean French people are like 40% conservative, 30% left, and the rest don't know, or is it just that's who showed up for the first round?
I think what the results point to, and let's be careful about adding up the numbers and saying,
Yeah.
oh, look, that means that the left can win. I think what is fair to say is that it shows us that this sort of like looming showdown that we've been hearing about since the last election in 2017 between Macron and Le Pen, and this is how politics are going to be. You have sort of Macron calls it Le Pen calls it the globalists versus the patriots.
Uh-huh. Okay.
And Macron, refers to it in different language, basically the nationalists versus the progressives. But this is sort of like the new political cleavage that is replacing the old left-right divide. This is like the thing that's been hammered into our heads on both sides. It works
Right.
for Macron to do it. It works for the far right to do it. I think what these results are showing is that this sort of recomposition of political life in France is not inevitable, and maybe is a lot less strong than its proponents have tried to make it seem, because you can see the remnants of this, left to right, old world way of thinking about politics, and maybe not remnants, but they're still there. When people are voting for these regional officials, and I think it also. And I would have said this even before the regional elections, but this sort of like showdown between Macron and Le Pen isn't inevitable, and there's a
Right.
whole lot of people in the country that don't feel represented by what's on offer. I don't know if that means that the left is going to win. It's unlikely, but it does mean that there's other political options out there, and I do think, frankly, I would say this before the regional elections, but I think there are millions of people in France who are attached to defending the French welfare model. They're opposed to the economic reforms under Macron. They want to tax the rich more. They want to raise the minimum wage. They want to improve people's protections at work. They also think that racism is a problem and is bad. And speaking about racism doesn't mean that you're a woke, multicultural, person who's trying to import American ideas. I think that block of the electorate exists. It's just a question of finding, a way to get those ideas into office, and that's where it gets a lot more tricky.
Of course, but it also suggests to me, and maybe this is my own bias at work, that even if the existing left parties have yet to electrify the electorate there, that there is a sort of potential for something like what Chantal Mouffe, the French political philosopher, calls a left populism, to come and take the place of what the socialists have been doing. I don't know. And I guess my last question for you, one of the surprises of the election, I'm told, Julien Bayou in the greater Paris region, 41 years old, Green Party leader, won close to 13% of the vote, marking him, they say, as the leading candidate on the left. What should we be thinking about Juliet?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the one sort of like left unity alliance that it's sort of a long shot, but that's a coalition now in the second round. They couldn't unite for the first round, but they're uniting for the second round. So that's the Green candidate, because he got the most votes of the more votes than other left-wing parties, is the head of the new coalition for the second round. That's the Greens, the Socialists, and La France Insoumise, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's party, and also the Communists that are all supporting the same candidate. So it'll be interesting to see if that sort of very brief left unity here, which will be like 6 days, it will, has positive consequences, especially for such a high-profile race. I think that could have an impact nationally speaking. It's unlikely that Bayou's going to win, but if he pulls this out, I think certainly there would be national political consequences. There was one other region in which all those same parties united in the north of France. That did not seem to work out so well, as people say in France. The mayonnaise did not. This is not going to work well. They use French idiomatic expressions. It did not work. The candidate in the north. This is now the opportunity for this left coalition in action to maybe show some real concrete results. Yeah, sure. If they won this, it would have a definite impact on the national conversation.
Well, it's fascinating to track the politics there. Of course, still a major global power, so its politics are important to all of us, and those of us who care about it, especially interested. So, and your reporting on it has been great. So, Cole Stangler, journalist and author of, among other things, the recent piece, "France is Becoming More Like America. It's Terrible." Thanks for your great reporting, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me again.
It was a pleasure. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.